I still remember the night when everything seemed perfect. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and my brother, Mark, was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. It was normal for Mark to stop by unannounced. He had always been close to both of us. In fact, he used to joke that he was practically part of our marriage. Back then, I laughed it off. I had no idea how close they had really become. The three of us spent the evening talking and laughing. Mark told a funny story about work, and Sarah added her usual witty remarks. I felt lucky. I had a wife who seemed devoted to me and a brother who was my best friend. Looking back, those moments were nothing but a cruel illusion. But there were subtle signs, things I ignored at the time. I noticed how Sarah's face lit up when Mark entered the room, how they exchanged inside jokes I didn't understand. Once, I caught Mark glancing at Sarah a little too long, but I brushed it off as harmless. I trusted them both completely. The real cracks started to show when Sarah began acting distant. She'd spend hours on her phone, claiming it was work. She smiled less when we were alone and seemed distracted during our conversations. I thought maybe she was stressed or needed space, so I gave her that. I didn't want to seem like the controlling husband who questioned her every move. Mark, on the other hand, started visiting more often. He'd show up unannounced, sometimes when I wasn't even home. I didn't think much of it, he was family after all. But then there were the hushed tones when they spoke, the quick exchanges of glances that seemed to carry a hidden message. One night, as Sarah cleared the dinner table, Mark offered to help. I noticed how close they stood in the kitchen, laughing about something I couldn't hear. I wanted to believe it was nothing. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The first real blow came when Sarah began canceling plans with me. She'd claimed she wasn't feeling well or had too much work to do. Yet, on those same nights, I'd find out she had gone out anyway without telling me. I ignored the pit in my stomach, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, Sarah was my wife and Mark was my brother. If there was anyone in the world I could trust, it was them. Or so I thought. That illusion of trust was about to shatter, and I had no idea how much it would change my life. Section 2. The first cracks appear. A few weeks later, Sarah's behavior became harder to ignore. She was no longer just distant, she was defensive. Small questions, like asking her how her day was, were met with irritation. If I asked about her frequent outings, she'd get angry and accuse me of being paranoid. I started noticing changes in Mark too. He was always someone I could count on, but now he avoided one-on-one conversations with me. If I asked about Sarah, his answers were vague and rushed. He'd often look at his phone or change the subject entirely. One night, Sarah claimed she had to work late. I decided to surprise her with dinner at her office. I packed her favorite takeout and headed over. When I arrived, her desk was empty. Confused, I asked a coworker if she was around, but they told me she had left hours ago. I drove home, frustrated but still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she ran errands after work and forgot to tell me. But as I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mark's car parked on the street. My heart sank. Walking into the house, I found Sarah and Mark sitting on the couch. They looked startled, as if I'd caught them doing something wrong, but nothing about the scene was incriminating. Sarah said Mark had just stopped by to drop off something he borrowed. Mark quickly excused himself and left before I could even say a word. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but the questions kept piling up in my mind. Why hadn't she told me Mark was coming over? Why did they both look so nervous? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't deny that something felt off. The next day, I asked Mark about the visit. He brushed it off, saying he had borrowed a book from Sarah and wanted to return it before he forgot. It sounded reasonable, but his tone was uneasy, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. From that point on, I began noticing patterns. Sarah's phone was always face down when I walked into the room, and she started being extra careful about her texts. She even changed her lock screen passcode, a small detail, but one that made my gut twist. I told myself I was overthinking. I didn't want to become the husband who doubted his wife at every turn. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder my suspicions grew. One day, I finally decided to confide in a close friend, David. He was someone I trusted completely, someone who had known me and my family for years. I told him about Sarah's behavior and how Mark seemed to be acting differently. David listened quietly and then said something that stayed with me. If your gut is telling you something's wrong, you need to pay attention. People don't act this way unless they're hiding something. It was the first time I allowed myself to truly consider the possibility that Sarah and Mark were betraying me. But I still didn't have proof. And without proof, I couldn't confront them. I decided to be patient. If they were hiding something, it would only be a matter of time before the truth came out. Little did I know, the truth was closer than I thought, and it was far worse than I imagined. A week later, my suspicions hit their peak. Sarah told me she had a work event that evening, one that would run late into the night. She said she might even stay at a hotel because it was being held in a neighboring city. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but something about her story felt rehearsed. After she left, I called her office. A friendly receptionist answered, and I casually asked if the company event was still happening. Her response made my heart race. Event? I don't think we have anything planned for tonight. Are you sure it's with us? I hung up, my mind spinning. Where was Sarah really going? My gut told me to find out for myself. I grabbed my car keys and decided to follow her. As I drove through the city, I kept a safe distance, careful not to be seen. She eventually pulled into the parking lot of a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. I parked far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to watch her every move. Minutes later, another car arrived. It was Mark's. I gripped the steering wheel, my chest tightening as I watched him step out. He looked around nervously before walking towards Sarah's car. She got out and hugged him, not a casual hug, but the kind of embrace that made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd done this. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. This was my wife. This was my brother. The two people I trusted most in the world. And they were meeting in secret like lovers. They walked into the restaurant together, laughing and leaning close. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of the car and followed them inside, my heart pounding with every step. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place designed for privacy. I spotted them in a corner booth, their heads close together. They didn't see me at first. Sarah was smiling at him in a way I hadn't seen in months, and Mark was holding her hand across the table. I walked up to them, my hands trembling. "So this is why you've both been acting so strange?" I said, my voice louder than I intended. They froze. Sarah's face turned pale, and Mark's eyes widened like a deer caught in headlights. "It's not what it looks like," Sarah stammered, pulling her hand away from Mark's. But the guilt was written all over their faces. "Not what it looks like?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "Then explain it to me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't form a single word. He looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes. Sarah started to cry, but I wasn't interested in her tears. I turned and walked out, leaving them sitting there in their silence. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't face either of them. I stayed at David's place, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? How could they do this to me? I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, I returned home. The house felt eerily quiet, but I could tell Sarah hadn't slept. She was sitting on the couch, her face swollen from crying. As soon as I walked in, she stood up and began speaking, her words tumbling out in a frantic attempt to explain. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "It didn't mean anything." I don't know what I was thinking. I stared at her, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You don't know what you were thinking? Sarah, this wasn't some accident. This was calculated. With my brother, of all people." She broke down, covering her face with her hands. But I didn't feel any sympathy. I wanted answers, not excuses. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded. She hesitated, looking away. That hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. "Tell me the truth, Sarah. Or I'll go straight to Mark and get it from him." Finally, she admitted it had been going on for months. It started when Mark began visiting us more often. They grew closer, she said, and what started as harmless flirting eventually became something more. She tried to justify it by saying she felt lonely because I'd been distant. Distant? I repeated, my voice rising. I was working hard for us, Sarah. For our future. And this is how you repay me. She cried harder, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to forgive, or even to listen. Pack your things, I said coldly. I want you out of this house by the end of the day. She begged me to reconsider, promising it was over, that she'd never speak to Mark again. But her words fell on deaf ears. I left the house and drove straight to my parents. My mother opened the door, surprised to see me so early. She immediately noticed the look on my face and asked what was wrong. At first, I hesitated. This wasn't just about me. It was about exposing Mark, too. But then I thought about everything they had done behind my back, the lies, the betrayal. They didn't deserve my silence. You need to know what's been going on, I told her. Mark and Sarah have been seeing each other. Behind my back. Her reaction was a mixture of disbelief and horror. What? That can't be true. Mark wouldn't do something like that, she said, shaking her head. I pulled out my phone and showed her the messages I had found after Sarah's confession. Late at night, I had scrolled through her phone while she was asleep, desperate for the full truth. What I saw confirmed everything, texts filled with intimate messages, plans to meet, and even photos they'd sent each other. My mother's hands trembled as she read the messages. I don't know what to say, she whispered. How could he do this to his own brother? I asked her to gather the family, including Mark, because I wanted everything out in the open. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure everyone knew the truth. When Mark arrived later that evening, he was greeted by the cold stares of our parents and siblings. He looked confused at first, but when he saw me, his face hardened. He knew exactly why we were all there. Mark, tell them, I said, my voice steady but filled with anger. Tell them what you've been doing with Sarah. He tried to deny it at first, but when I pulled out the screenshots of their messages, his excuses fell apart. My mother burst into tears, and my father's face turned red with anger. You betrayed your own brother, my father shouted. How could you stoop so low, Mark? Mark tried to justify it, claiming it was a mistake, that he never meant to hurt me. But no one was buying it. My family sided with me completely, their disappointment in Mark evident in every word and every glare. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother for who he really was, not just someone who made a mistake, but someone who put his own selfish desires above everything else, including family. But this was far from over. I wasn't just going to walk away from this betrayal. I had a plan to make sure both Sarah and Mark faced the consequences of their actions. After the confrontation with my family, I knew I couldn't let Mark and Sarah walk away without repercussions. They had shattered my trust, humiliated me, and disrespected everything we once stood for. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about holding them accountable. The first step in my plan was to protect myself. I contacted a lawyer to understand my legal options. Since Sarah and I shared a house, I wanted to ensure the separation would be in my favor. I also wanted to make sure Mark couldn't manipulate the family into thinking he was the victim. Next, I started gathering evidence. I saved every text message, photo, and email I had found on Sarah's phone. I even documented her confession, recording it on my phone when she begged me not to leave. I wasn't going to let them wiggle their way out of this. But the real turning point came when I uncovered something even darker. While digging through Sarah's financial records, something I'd never thought to do before, I noticed several unexplained withdrawals and transactions. She had been sending money to Mark. At first, it looked like small amounts, but over time, it added up to thousands of dollars. I confronted Sarah about it. At first, she denied it, but when I showed her the bank statements, she broke down. He needed help, she said, trying to justify it. He was struggling with money, and I just wanted to be there for him. I didn't buy her excuses. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about deceit on every level. She wasn't just cheating on me emotionally and physically, she was also funneling our shared finances to my own brother. Armed with this new information, I went back to my parents. They were horrified, especially my father, who had always prided himself on the family sticking together. "Mark doesn't just owe you an apology," he said, his voice filled with anger. "He owes you every cent he took, and more." To ensure that Mark couldn't charm his way out of the situation, I decided to make everything public. At the next family gathering, a birthday dinner for our youngest cousin, I arrived with printed copies of the evidence. I handed them out to everyone there. The room went silent as people read through the messages and saw the proof of Sarah's financial betrayal. Mark tried to storm out, but my father blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere until you explain yourself," he said firmly. Mark stammered, trying to spin the narrative in his favor. But the evidence was undeniable. The entire family turned against him. He was no longer the golden child or the trusted sibling, he was an outcast. As for Sarah, she wasn't even invited to the gathering. By then, she had moved out of the house, and I had filed for divorce. I made sure she understood that there was no coming back from this. But the final blow came when I shared the story with her boss. Sarah worked for a company that prided itself on integrity and professionalism. I sent them an anonymous tip, complete with evidence of her unethical behavior. Within a week, she was fired. Mark wasn't spared either. Word spread through our extended family, and soon, he lost his social standing. People stopped inviting him to events, and his so-called friends began distancing themselves. I could have stopped there, but I wasn't done. I had one more move left to make, something that would ensure they'd never forget the damage they caused. With Sarah and Mark's lives already unraveling, I focused on one last piece of my plan, something that would leave a lasting mark on their reputations and serve as a reminder of their betrayal. I wasn't looking for petty revenge. I wanted to deliver a lesson they'd never forget. I started by gathering all the evidence I had compiled, texts, photos, financial records, and created a detailed account of the betrayal. But this time, I turned it into a cautionary tale. I didn't use their names directly, but I made it unmistakably clear who the story was about. Then, I shared the story on a popular community forum under the title, "When Family Betrays You, My Wife and My Brother's Affair." The post went viral within days. People from around the world weighed in, offering support, sharing similar experiences, and expressing outrage at Sarah and Mark's behavior. The story resonated with thousands, and the comments were overwhelmingly on my side. But I didn't stop there. Mark worked as a real estate agent, and his reputation was everything in his line of work. Using the same anonymous account, I made sure the story found its way to local groups and forums where his clients and colleagues were active. Though I never outright named him, enough details lined up for people to connect the dots. His clients started backing out of deals, and his employer began questioning his professionalism. As for Sarah, I made sure her new employers knew about her past actions. She struggled to hold down a steady job, as her reputation followed her wherever she went. But the most satisfying part came when I confronted them one last time, not in anger, but in cold, calculated finality. I invited both Mark and Sarah to a public place to meet. They were hesitant but agreed, likely out of guilt. When we sat down, I placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of all the evidence, along with screenshots of the viral posts and the messages of support I'd received. "This is the legacy you've left behind," I said, sliding the folder toward them. They flipped through the pages, their faces growing pale. "Why are you doing this?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Because you didn't just betray me," I replied. "You betrayed the trust of everyone who believed in you. Now the world knows the truth." Sarah tried to plead with me, saying she was sorry and wanted to make things right. But her words felt empty, just like every promise she'd made before. "This isn't about apologies," I said. "This is about consequences." I walked away from that meeting feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time, I wasn't consumed by anger or sadness. I felt closure, knowing they would carry the weight of their actions for years to come. After confronting Sarah and Mark for the final time, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let their betrayal define my life. They had already stolen enough of my peace, and it was time to focus on myself. The first step was reclaiming my space. I renovated the house, removing every trace of the life Sarah and I had built together. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and even adopted a dog, a loyal companion who brought unexpected joy into my life. Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing. At first, I resisted the idea, thinking I could manage the emotional toll on my own. But sitting down with someone who could guide me through the storm made a world of difference. I began to understand that their actions were a reflection of their own flaws, not mine. Through this process, I rediscovered who I was outside of my relationship. I reconnected with old friends, traveled to places I'd always dreamed of visiting, and poured myself into new hobbies. I even joined a local hiking group where I found solace in the quiet strength of nature. As for my family, the fallout with Mark was difficult, but it brought the rest of us closer together. My parents supported me unconditionally, and my siblings rallied around me in a way I hadn't expected. It was clear that Mark had isolated himself, and while his absence was a painful reminder of the betrayal, it also underscored the importance of trust and loyalty within the family. Months later, I found myself in a new relationship. It wasn't something I had planned, but it happened naturally. She was kind, understanding, and patient, qualities I hadn't realized I needed so much. We took things slow, allowing me to rebuild my confidence in love and trust. One day, while sitting on a quiet hilltop during a hike, I reflected on everything that had happened. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it all felt like a distant memory. What remained was a sense of resilience. I had survived the worst and come out stronger. As for Sarah and Mark, their lives continued to spiral. Mark struggled to regain his reputation, and Sarah's attempts to start over were marred by her past. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had tried to stay together for a while but eventually fell apart, consumed by guilt and mistrust. I didn't gloat over their misfortune, but I also didn't feel sorry for them. They had made their choices, and they were living with the consequences. In the end, their betrayal became a turning point for me, a painful but necessary chapter that led me to a better version of myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.